Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and to Coffee and Cartridges. This is the 50th episode, and today we're going to talk about gunpowder, ball powder versus extruded powder, and all kinds of other interesting things. Stay tuned. Alright, before we get into the details of this video, let's kind of get a foundation level understanding of powder. Check this out. What is gunpowder and why are there so many different kinds? What makes them different? Smokeless gunpowder comes in many different shapes, primarily stick, ball, and flake powder. And not only shapes, but many different sizes. This size and shape of the kernel, along with many chemical additives, give each powder a different burn rate. From very fast burning powders that you'll find in pistol and shotgun cartridges to very slow burning powders that you'll find in rifles, especially Magnum cartridges. But at the core of it all, there lies the base, and the foundation of smokeless gunpowder is nitrocellulose. All smokeless gunpowder is nitrocellulose, and that's its single base. However, there are double base powders that add nitroglycerin as well. So the biggest differentiating factor is it single base, just nitrocellulose, or is it double base, nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin? All right, so that kind of gives you some of the basics, and now let's get into more of the details. You've got your ball powder, your stick powder, your flake powder. There's some different ones in there too. This is a crude analogy, I guess, but think of like a bratwurst, a hot dog, and a smoky. Different sizes, different lengths. That's kind of like your different kinds of stick powder. And then you can cut that in half, and you've got your shortcuts. You can cut it in multiple pieces, and you've got your ball powder. Or you can cut them really thin, and you've got your flakes. There's some generalities I guess we need to define or explain, and then I'll get into more of my actual, results that I've found and what my opinions are. But generally speaking, single base powder that is extruded has been historically the most accurate and consistent, or I should say has produced the most accurate loads and is the most consistent powder. Especially like the Hodgson Extreme line. So H1000, H4895, H4350, Varget. Those powders are single base, extruded, and temperature insensitive. And they've been known for a long time to be great for consistency. So if you're a long range target shooter, probably using one of those powders. To my knowledge, all spherical or ball powder, all of it is double base. With extruded, you have some single, some double base. So the Alliant reloader powders, like Reloader 22 for instance, those have always been extruded powders but double base. And so you typically get more velocity out of the double base powders. So the general consensus has been double base ball powder is the most inaccurate and most temperature sensitive. Now there's some great ball powders out there that have performed really well for a long time, and there's some newer ones that I'm going to talk about later that may be even better. But that's generally been the consensus among most shooters, especially target shooters. Single base, probably better than double base, with some exceptions, and then stick powder generally is better than ball powder when it comes to accuracy and consistency. And if you can get it temperature insensitive, if you can get it to where it doesn't change a whole lot depending on different temperatures, that's the ideal. And so you look at a powder like W748, it's a double base ball powder, and I don't think anyone would be using that to win a 1,000-yard F-class match. But Varget, very similar burn rate, is a single base extruded temperature insensitive powder. They're probably going to pick Varget over W748. So that's the conventional wisdom and generally speaking the consensus among most shooters. But that's way oversimplifying it. And especially nowadays, you have a lot of new powders coming out. They're kind of game changers. So I mentioned Alliant reloader powders are double base. That's why they get generally better velocity at the same pressures. But like Reloader 23, Reloader 16, Reloader 26, these newer powders are also more temperature stable. And so they've kind of taken the best of both worlds, and they're really good powders overall. And they've also come out with the Winchester Stay-Ball line that are ball powders that are temperature stable. And so that's been awesome, like Stay-Ball Match, 6.5 Stay-Ball, and Stay-Ball HD. These are more temperature stable ball powders. And so really both stick powder and ball powder have some powders that are more temperature stable and less temperature stable. So to compare the two types of powder really isn't as straightforward as it used to be. And just because someone says, hey, this is a powder that is temperature stable, doesn't mean they're all created equal. Varget might be more temperature stable than H4895 or vice versa. And then you might have some powders that are not advertising stability that have been around for a long time, some single base extruded powders like, IMR 4064, IMR 4350. They're probably more temperature sensitive than some of these extreme line of Hodgdon powders are, but what's the ratio? So all powders are different. The ones that advertise being more temperature stable probably are, and seem to be from my experience, but all powders are different. So there isn't just a cutoff line where these powders are good and these powders are bad. They're all at different levels of the spectrum. Some powders, like CFE 223, they advertise copper fouling eraser. So they have a additive in there or some way they process it where it hopefully will reduce copper fouling. So there's a lot of newer powders that advertise a lot of things. There's some older powders that are still outstanding. And there's some newer powders that maybe aren't the greatest. So it's really a case-by-case basis, and specifically on what powder that you're going to need for your application. Typically speaking, the more overbore the cartridge, and especially with a longer barrel, you're going to need a slower burning powder. Also, typically speaking, with a heavier bullet in the same cartridge caliber, all other things being equal, the heavier bullets will also need a more slower burning powder. It really just comes down to volume and pressure and the correlation of the two. And the heavier and longer the projectile is, the more force it takes to get it through the rifling of the barrel, the more pressure will build. And also when you have less volume, say a 26-inch 6mm barrel versus a 26-inch 30 caliber barrel, a lot of powder going through a much smaller hole, pressure once again increases quicker. And so with overbore cartridges and heavier bullets, generally speaking, you're going to need slower burning powders. But it really does come down to a volume, caliber, pressure ratio. And so the same powder could be good in 22 caliber, 30 caliber, and 375 caliber, but vastly different cases with different amounts of powder behind those cases. Really, it's quite interesting. And so to pick a powder and to start using that powder in reloading is not a guesswork. It's not, well, I think this will be all right. You really need to use a reloading manual or go to an online source like Hodgdon's website or Barnes' website or something, some online source. You need to go off of those. Now, there are times you can kind of give educated guesses based on research and understanding what's going on, but just because somebody tells you I used X amount of powder and it worked great, don't do that. Every chamber is a little different, every rifle is a little different, and people shoot in different climates at different elevations and different temperatures. And so you can't just copy and paste load data. It's a bad idea. Now, in the big scheme of things, I'm going to admit here that I have limited reloading experience. I've reloaded since I was 16, but mainly with the help of my uncle. And then since I started my YouTube channel, I've done a lot of my own reloading with my own equipment, and I've gained a lot of knowledge. But in the big scheme of things, there's plenty of you guys watching now, right now, that have a lot more experience than I do at reloading, and therefore know a lot more about powders and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert, but I would like to share some things that I've discovered. And I guess that leads me to this kind of overall point is I really like ball powder, double base ball powder. When I think of my very best loads, that 130 grain TTSX and the 308, that was the tack powder. When I think of that 172 Spear Impact in 308, that was CFE 223. When I think of that 140 grain Spear Impact in my 6.5 284, that was Mag Pro. I've got much better velocity with Mag Pro in 270 short mag than I have H4831, IMR 4350, H1000, and so I've just found powders like that to be really good. Big Game has been a powder recently that I've started to really like in the 7mm OA, in the 30-06, and a lot of cartridges. Superformance, you know, I think about that 162 grain AMAX going 2800 feet per second, and Superformance was outstanding. Heads and shoulders better than the rest. Now you're probably thinking, yeah, but you're just talking about velocity. So when I'm reloading, I'm shooting at 100 yards. You know, I can shoot out to 300, actually 400 yards at the little range that I shoot at. But I generally speaking just shoot at 100 yards. And I'm just kind of testing things out, making videos, playing around. And if I get minute of angle, I'm happy. That could be with Varget or H4350, or that could be with Big Game or Superformance. I generally see very similar results, and I usually shoot for minute of angle. Now, of course, I would prefer 3/4 minute of angle or half minute of angle. But if I get minute of angle, I'm happy. I'm generally speaking looking for inch group at 100 yards with very low SDs, like definitely under 10, hopefully under 5. And then the velocity that I'm looking for. And all these hand loads that I'm making are for hunting. And to be honest, I'm probably going to produce a lot more hand loads than I'm actually ever going to use in real life. But it's just fun, I enjoy it, and I like making videos about it. But when you're hunting, it's really about terminal performance, trajectory as well, and the BC of the bullet is also part of it. And so the muzzle velocity, that starting point, is very instrumental. It's really the primary focus, is what is your muzzle velocity. And so I do tend to focus first and foremost on muzzle velocity and standard deviation of that muzzle velocity. Like if it's all over the place, it's not good. Or if I'm getting the velocity I want, but it's a 2-inch group, 3-inch group, that's not okay. So it's not just velocity. I want an inch group, I want a low SD, but I would like to hit a certain velocity. That's gonna aid in downrange performance. That's gonna aid in expansion and penetration of the bullet. Of course, all bullets are constructed differently, and so it depends on what type of bullet that you're using and what range you plan on shooting it at. But getting the muzzle velocity that I'm going after is my #1 job. And then hopefully I have the accuracy and the low SDs that I want. If not, I might tinker with seating depth, or I might tinker with some other powders. But if I can't get good velocity, then I'm gonna throw it away. I'm gonna say, well, never mind, it's not worth it. Spoiler alert, I am gonna, at some point, probably in the fall, be shooting some A-tips out of my 308, doing a little series on that. In that particular video series, not going to be concerned with velocity at all. It's going to be simply group size. But for the most part, I'm using hunting bullets on my videos, and I'm focusing on hunting performance, and muzzle velocity is an important factor in that. Here's something I've discovered, I've learned, it just continually happens over and over again. And I would like to know from you guys, especially those that have a lot more experience with reloading than I do, if you've seen the same thing. So here's the situation. When I'm looking at a reloading manual and I'm looking at different loads and I'm looking at, here's what it topped out as far as max load with the muzzle velocity. And it'll have all kinds of different powders on there. It'll have single base stick powders, double base ball powders, and sometimes I'll pick a stick powder. I'll pick, H4350, or I'll pick IMR 4064. And I go out there and I never get what the velocity max was. Like if I'm close, because I generally start in the middle. They have the min and the max, and I kind of start in the middle and then I head toward max. Sometimes I'm maybe a little closer to max than the middle, but generally speaking, I'm in that middle and I head toward max, half grain or grain at a time. I start out with a grain and then I slow down to about a half grain when I'm about a grain and a half under max. And I'll usually have one loaded up over max just to see. Obviously, I wouldn't shoot that if I was seeing pressure signs beforehand. But I've noticed when I do that, and it's a single base stick powder, I never get the velocity that I wanted. I've got really good velocity with H4350 in my 30-06, in my 6.5 284, but I went over the max with like no signs of pressure, which I'm going to get back to that in a second. But the book said I should get this, and I didn't get anywhere close to that. I remember using IMR 4064 one time. Wasn't anywhere close what it said I should get. So I just kept slowly adding a half grain, a half grain, half grain. And I eventually got great velocity, but I was significantly over the book max. So I wouldn't even tell you what I did nor what I recommended, but I did the experiment and I tested it out. And I finally, at the very, very end, got a little bit of pressure, but not much. With ball powder, let's say it says you're going to get 2800 with super performance. So you're going to get, like on the Barnes website, you're going to get 3250 with tack. I pretty much get that. So if I load the max load of ball powder from what an online published powder manufacturer says I should do, or a reloading manual, if I do that and I go out and shoot, I get just about exactly what it says with ball powder. But when I do that with stick powder, I never do. I never get the velocities with stick powder that it says I'm going to get. Now I think this is more to do with single base versus double base, because I can think back to when I was using a Reloader 22 and it performed very similar to these ball powders that I'm talking about. So it's probably not the ball powder, it's more the double base. And so let's just say that when I use double base, what the book says I'm going to get is pretty much what I get. But when I use single base, it never is. And in order to get that velocity, I kind of have to go beyond where it says I should go. But the flip side of that is, when I'm using the double base, I do see signs of pressure pretty much where it tells me I'm going to. Like it'll tell me this is the max. And if you go beyond this, you're probably out of pressure. And with double base powder, I pretty much see that. It is confirmed. But I don't see pressure with the single base. So I feel like single base powder, obviously it doesn't have the nitroglycerin, it doesn't have the added energy. And so for the same pressure, there is less energy. So it makes sense that you're going to typically get better velocity out of a double base powder. But it just seems more stable. And I'm not referring to temperature stability. I'm just referring to stability. It's like to get the potential out of that single base nitrocellulose only powder, you almost have to go beyond what it says. But when doing that, are you above pressure, even though you're not seeing signs? Because it seems like when I hit pressure with double base powder, it's pretty clear, and it's right where the book says it was going to be, but it's not as clear with single base powder. And I've noticed it specifically with single based stick powder. Have you guys noticed that? I would love to know. if I'm not the only one that has seen that. But most people, the thing that they care about with ball powder versus stick powder is how it drops the powder, how it feeds the powder. So the bigger and longer those logs are, those extruded sticks are, the less accurate your powder measure is probably going to be, for simple, obvious reasons. You've got big logs dropping down instead of just little bitty pieces. And so just a couple of those logs drop down, and that's a significant amount of grains compared to 50, 60, 100 little tiny balls that are much smaller. So it's easier to get accuracy with ball powder, especially, you know, if you're not weighing it out by hand and you're just relying on it to just dump the powder, or you're using something like I have, the Chargemaster Link. When I'm using ball powder, as long as it's within 1/10 of the grain, I'm good. If it's ever over 1/10 of a grain, I dump it back in and do it again. And I almost never have to do that with ball powder. And I probably have to do that 1 out of every 5 times, maybe 1 out of every 10 times with stick powder. The shortcut stick powder is a little better, obviously. But that really is the big focus, is that people like ball powder for that reason. Or they don't care about that and they like stick powders for the other reasons I've already explained. But to me, I'm gonna stand there and watch each charge happen, and I'm gonna make sure it's within 1/10 of a grain anyway. And so to me, it's not a big deal. It is nice to not have to dump this, you know, powder back in the container and have it redo it. So it does save time using ball powder in my setup. But then stick powder just seems so much cleaner. And it generally is cleaner because it's usually single base, right? So there's no nitroglycerin added to it. Plus it's just bigger pieces, bigger kernels so like when you're changing the powder out in your Chargemaster, it's much easier to clean it and switch it out faster with stick powder. Say Varget versus, you know, Mag Pro. The Mag Pro is just got so many tiny little ball kernels that go everywhere. And of course there's the nitroglycerin added in because it's double base. It's just a dirtier powder, okay? And so it seems a lot cleaner with stick powder. If I'm using Varget, it's so clean. I just clean it out of there, brush it off, dump it, bam. And I can go to the next powder. So ball powder meters better, but stick powder is just cleaner to work with. A YouTube channel that I respect and watch all his videos is Desert Dog. And I know he is one who's got way more experience than I do at reloading. And he's all about the Hodgson extreme powders like H4350, Varget, you know, things like that. And that's pretty much all that he uses, is that type of powder. Read forums on F-class shooters and the powders that they use. It's a lot of H4831, it's a lot of H4350, it's a lot of Varget. It's the same type of powders. And so even though I haven't experienced it personally on the little range that I shoot in, I haven't noticed a real difference in accuracy. Based on all that, you would have to say it probably is, you know, a single base extruded powder that's more temperature stable, probably is, all other things being equal, more consistent, leading to more accuracy. So I think that you could definitely say that. But when it comes to hunting, especially if you're looking for a muzzle velocity, you know, that you have thought about and you want, it's desired, I really like ball powder. I really like my double base ball powder. I love CFE 223, Mag Pro, TAC, Big Game, Superformance. I just really like those powders. They perform so good to me. They're so much more straightforward. What the book says they're going to get, they either do that or even better. And where the book says they're going to have pressure, they usually do. Or maybe you can get a little bit more out of them, but it's just more straightforward. You know, I've used a lot of IMR 4350, H 4350, Accurate 4350, IMR 4064, Reloader 22, and on and on and on and on. A lot of stick powders I have used. Varget, H1000, H4831, tons of them. I just never get the velocity that I'm looking for unless I go well beyond what the book says I should be going. But with ball powder, it's like a home run. It's just straightforward. It gets you what it says it's going to get you, and it's easier to get the velocities you want, and I just like it better. So at this time, I prefer double-base ball powder. And I know I'm one of the few people on YouTube that's going to say that, and I'm in the minority, but that's just my experience. I just really like some of these double-base ball powders. And, you know, I haven't used them a ton yet. I have used 6.5 Sta-Ball a decent amount, but I do like the idea of these temperature stable double-base ball powders. That just really sounds like a great idea. So I am excited in the future to use more of that. Now I'm going to end on this, and this might be what I think is the most critical point of picking your powder, and that's case fill. So I can think back to times where I've used a certain powder that didn't even get close to the shoulder, and you could shake the cartridge and hear and feel the powder moving around. Got the velocity I was looking for, but it was just, for whatever reason, either a faster powder or just, you know, its chemistry was different, and I didn't need a full case. In fact, if I would have filled the case, I would have been way over pressure. But I typically have come to the point where I try to stay away from that. And I think the best thing you can do, if you're trying to get the optimum performance out of your hand loads, that goes down to the velocity that you're looking for with the good SDs, but it also goes to a very consistent burn leading to potential accuracy. I think the number one thing you can do is find a powder that fills that case perfectly, like around 90 to 100%. I don't think you want to compress it a lot, but a slight compression I think is fine. If there's just a little bit of gap in there, a little bit of room, I think that's fine too. And then leading up to just a little bit of compression, I think that's okay. But man, all these really good loads that I've come across, that's kind of where I ended up. Is that, you know, they had a half-minute group, a three-quarter-minute group, SD under 5, great velocity. Almost every time it had a case fill that was just about perfect. And so obviously that comes down to the burn rate. H110 versus H1000, completely different. Even though they have a lot of similar numbers and letters, completely different burn rates, gonna react totally different. And to get the same pressure, you would need much less of the H110. And so my recommendation is, of course, you definitely want a powder that has the right burn rate for the cartridge, and whether it's overbore or not overbore, how much volume and pressure that you're dealing with there. And of course the weight of the bullet, but also think about case fill. If you can get to like that 90%, 95% case fill, where the bullet is not gonna touch, or just barely touch, or maybe slightly compress, that's like perfect. And I've got my best results, and my best hand loads have come when I reached that level of case fill. There are times I've used a powder where I could have put more in, and I still wouldn't have got pressure, but there was just no more room left in that case, and it was severe compression. And then I've used powders where you got a lot of room in there, but you really can't put any more because it's going to get over pressure. So neither one of those situations is what I consider to be ideal. But get that good case fill, and I think you'll find what you're looking for. Now I could make a part 2 to this, part 3, part 4, part 5. There's so much more I didn't even talk about with powders. But I'd love to know your comments. What are some of your favorite powders? You know, I really like the double-base ball powders. They're just really some of my favorites. List in the comments, what are your favorites? Also, that scenario that I mentioned with the double base versus single base, have you noticed that same thing? I'd love to know about that. Like this video if you've liked it. Please subscribe if you haven't already. More videos like this coming out. Hopefully you have a great day, and until next time, take care.